So we have begun the section on tzitzis. We spoke about the specialty of the mitzvah of tzitzis. We spoke about the two different types of garments. There's the talis katan, the small garment which is worn as part of one's clothes throughout the day. And then there's the talis gadol, the larger garment which is used for davening. And how they need to be done in the correct way. And therefore, it's important to be sure to buy them from a trusted source. We mentioned there's a concept of not mixing wool and linen, and how that would be relevant with tzitzis as well. And then we spoke about where the hole should be positioned in the corner. Finally, we spoke about the nuts and the coils, and we did that briefly. So maybe today we could have another look of exactly how it works, because it will actually be quite relevant in the next section, which we're going to do, which is when we put on the tzitzis, because one of the steps in putting on the tzitzis is to inspect them. And when we inspect them, we want to know what we are looking out for to ensure that they are kosher. So let's take a look at the tying. If you see on the right-hand side over here, we mentioned that the tzitzis, each string has 5 sets of nuts. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And between each set of nuts, there are coils. And each group of coils has a certain number. So the first set of coils are wound 7 times. The second set of coils are wound 8 times. The third set of coils are wound 11 times. And the fourth set of coils are wound 13 times. Between each set of coils, there is a double nut. So there's 4 sets of coils and a total of 5 double nuts. That's as far as how many coils and how many nuts. He says, however, in order to make the tzitzis look beautiful, you want the nuts to be evenly spaced. Now, since over here there's only 7 coils, and on this side there's 13, so what that means is that when you start, they're more scattered. You'll take a look at your talis, and ideally that's the way it should be. So if you look on this side, you can't really see on the camera, but the coils are very spread out because there's only 7 of them. And then set number 2, it's a little tighter. Set number 3, it's tighter. And set number 4, it's very tight. That way, although you're going between 7 and 13 coils, the distance between the nuts is equal. Okay, this is not a requirement. This is just a preference. Meaning if you check your talis and you see that it is not that way, that certainly does not mean that your talis is disqualified, but it does mean that if you're looking to buy a talis, that is something that you would notice as far as seeing that it is done in the most beautiful way possible. Okay, now if we take the overall string from beginning to end, so it needs to be at least a total of 12 thumb breadths wide, okay, which is approximately 23 centimeters. Now, of this total of 12 thumb breadths, so if we just measure over here, so that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then this is actually a bit longer. So it's a minimum of 12 thumb breadths. You can actually measure using the width of your thumb. Now, of the total of 12 thumb breadths, 1/3 is tied and 2/3 is hanging loose. So if we look over here, we'll see if I fold it over and fold it over again, that's pretty much how it works out. So the first third is knotted, and then the next 2/3 are loose. Those are the strings. That's the ideal way that the tzitzis should be made. And one final point is when you count the tzitzis, you're going to see that there's 8 strings. but really there are only 4 strings. Why is that? Does anybody know? So the answer to that will be on this side. If you look over here by the talus, you'll see that there's a loop. So really there's only 4 strings. The 4 strings are slipped through the hole, and then they come back around, and then they get tied together. So really what that means is that these 8 strings are not 8 strings, they're 4 strings. It starts over here, goes all the way through, goes through the garment, out the other side of the hole, comes back down and ends up over here. So really we have a total of 4 long strings that have been folded in half into 8 strings. Now, the reason this is relevant is because we'll see soon, there is a minimum requirement if the tzitzis rup, and you want to be sure which string is which. So ideally, these 2 sets should be kept separate. Let me explain what I mean. See over here, they're quite easily hanging separately, right? But that's because they came after the 2 sets of knots. If I undo these knots, which I'm doing right now, I'm going to make another little knot here so I can remember which side's which. So I undid the one knot and I undid the other knot. Okay. Now, in this section, all you have is that the strings are just going round and round and round. Now, what that means is that there's 1 string that's going round, and the other 8 strings are all bunched together. So at this point, it's impossible to know which string is from this side and which string is from that side. Okay, so really they could have gotten mixed together. Now, why does that matter? Because every one of the 4 long strings needs to remain intact. Now, if you don't know which one's which, and 2 of them rip, there may be 2 of the very same string. But if you've kept them separate, so over here, I just tied another little knot over here so I would know which ones were which, because I did keep them separate. So if you kept them separate, so now I'll retie the knot. So since I kept them separate, if let's say one of these strings rip, 2 of these strings rip, then I'll know for certain that they're not the same string. Meaning if these 2 strings ripped right over here, I'll know that they both have their other half on the other side. As opposed to if they got mingled together, then you won't know which one's which. Now, after giving this long introduction of how preferably the strings should be kept to their sides when the person is tying the tzitzis, so maybe we'll skip to the halacha that speaks about when the tzitzis get ripped, so you'll see the significance of that in the same class, and then we could go back to the other halachas in between if we have time. This is also relevant. It's very common, very, very common with time for the string for knots to come loose. So right now it looks fairly tight, but gradually as the days pass by, the knot slowly loosens, and then you have that taking place. And gradually, I don't know how well you can see it in the camera, eventually the knot just falls out completely. And then that's the one knot, it's a double knot. And once that happens to both knots, then the coils begin to just unravel. And on a regular basis, I will notice, and I'll bring it to a person's attention, and Shabbos would be an issue because you can't tie knots. On a regular basis, I'll notice that people's taluses, the strings actually become untied, which is a problem, and it's not a big deal. It just needs to be fixed correctly. So then again, when they become unraveled, you can't just recoil it and tie it once again.
Space, so you could use the other freezer.
Then, sorry.
Go to the bottom there if you want.
Because then the if it just unravels and you retie it, you recoil it, then again you're not going to know which strings are from which side. So what you would need to do is you'd have to pull from the previous set of knots. That way you know which side was which. Anyhow, I guess what you're really seeing from all of this is that there's a real mechanism of exactly how the strings are tied. It's far from haphazard. Not only does it need to be done by hand, but the person tying them needs to keep track that the four long strings have their two sides on the same separate sides and that they don't mix together. So let's skip along now to the halacha of what happens if they get ripped. Now it's quite complicated. So I'm going to do the second half of the halacha. You could look at the first half inside, which gives the bottom line. Okay. But the idea is that each one of the four long strings needs to retain. Okay, let me just say it outside and short for starters. And then we'll go through it inside. So we're moving to halacha 13. Okay, so the idea is you have four long strings that have come across from one side to the other. Now two of the four strings need to remain completely intact, and the other two need to remain somewhat intact. So if you've kept your sides, then if one string over here rips, it's fine because it means that 3 out of the 4 are complete, and the 4th out of the 4 still has the other side, so it still has the minimum measure. If 2 of them rip, it's also fine because it means you have 2 complete strings and 2 incomplete strings, meaning you'd have 2 complete strings, and then since the one that's dropping there ripped, it means you have 2 complete, and this one is kind of incomplete. Once you have 3 strings that rip, then you no longer have the minimum of 2 complete strings, and then the tzitzis would be invalid. This is all obviously after the fact that the outside, all the strings should meet the measurements. But if they did rip, the idea is that as long as you have, of the 4 original strings, 2 that are completely intact and 2 that are somewhat intact, you're fine. Now, what does this mean practically speaking? Therefore, if one string tears from the 8 strings which are hanging at the end, even if it tore completely up to the links, meaning it got cut off right over here, right where the coils end, it is certainly valid since the one string is only half of a larger string because it's going to go all the way up and back down, and the other side is still there on the other side. And there's still enough left on the other half to tie a bow and even more. If 2 strings tore, and they did not remain in each one 4 thumb breadths, that even if there is the possibility that these 2 strings are really part of one string, then the tzitzis is then. If there is the possibility that these 2 strings are really part of one string, then it's invalid. Meaning, if you're not certain that the sides were kept separate, then once 2 strings rip, although it might be this string and this string, you never know. It could be this is really the same string that went around and came back, but then the sides weren't kept separate, so they both ended up on the same side. So once 2 strings rip, you need to be sure that the tzitzis, when they were tied, the sides were kept separate, because if they were, and the 2 tzitzis are from the same side, then you know they both still have their counterpart. Thus, if it is certain that they are from 2 separate strings, for example, if at the time of tying them, he was careful to always tie the 4 ends on one side with the 4 ends of the other, as I've already mentioned at the end of paragraph 5, which we were just looking at inside. And now there's a tear in 2 of the ends located on one side of the knot. In this particular case, it is certain that the tears were in 2 separate strings. And since there is still in each string the amount of 4 thumb breadths and even more on the second side of the knot, meaning although these two ripped, you still have the other end of that very same string, which is still intact. And the other 2 strings are complete, the tzitzis are valid. Okay, so basically the bottom line is that if 1 string rips out of your 8, no problem. Once 2 strings rip, it might be a problem, it might not. Once 3 strings rip, then you definitely have a problem. They need to be fixed. Okay, so 1 is not a problem, 3 is a problem, 2 is possibly a problem. But now he says that's provided they ripped in the area that they hang. If they ripped up here, like right where it attaches to the garment, so you see a rip over here, so then that's definitely a problem. So if 1 string tears at the point where they hang in the hole, the tzitzis is invalid. We mentioned that if 1 string tears and there remains a sufficient amount to tie a bow, that the tzitzis is valid. This is so if at the time the making of the tzitzis, all of the strings were the proper length, meaning everything we've discussed is all of when the tzitzis were tied originally, they were done correctly, and afterwards one of them ripped. Okay, so that's as far as what happens if the tzitzis, if the strings tear. Well, since we already made mention of keeping the two sides separate, I want to explain why the two sides should be kept separate. Now we'll go back to where we were up to, which is halacha number 7. Okay. So now, and you'll see how it fits in perfectly to what we just discussed. He says that before putting on the talis, the tzitzis should be checked. They should be inspected. You should have a daily inspection of your tzitzis before you put the talis on. Just check that they're valid. Now you know what you're checking for. Now that we looked ahead in the later section, you're wanting to be sure that all the 5 knots are there, that the coils are all there, the 7, 8, 11, and 13, and that none of the strings have been ripped, like we just spoke about right now. Okay. So now how often do you need to check? See, he says every day. Why every day? The Shulchan Aruch says, because if we don't make it as a daily practice, then you'll never check altogether. So either it's never or it's daily. So we say every day you check your tzitzis to make sure they're correct. And you must also check the strings that go through the hole as well, meaning don't just check over here, but also check up here in case something is ripped on that side, as well as the shavashim. The strings should also be separated so that they might not be entangled with each other. Sometimes these strings can all get tied up. So just while you're checking your tzitzis, you kind of allow your fingers to run through the strings to make sure that they're all hanging separately. If you are late in coming to shul, and if you take the time to start doing this whole inspection, you're going to miss the minyan, so then you could rely on checking them tomorrow. He doesn't say what happens if you come late every day, because I guess that's not even an option. Okay. So we've checked the tzitzis, we've come to shul, and that's just the idea that you see over here. I'm hanging my talis over my shoulder, because that's the kind of standard practice that as you're getting ready, you take it out of your bag and you hang it over your shoulder. Then it's a great position where you can kind of just look up and you can see exactly what's going on. You can see right over here what's happening by the holes, and you can see the coils, you see the strings, but you actually take one. What I do is I hold all 4 in my hand, then I separate one, and I quickly inspect it, and then slide my fingers down to make sure it's not tangled, and then the same with the second, the same with the third, and then with the fourth. So once you've checked them, so you need to make a bracha. And this is actually the first time we talk about making a bracha on a mitzvah in the Shulchan Aruch. Not really, because we did give a bracha when we washed our hands in the morning, and that's a rabbinic mitzvah to wash your hands. So that's a bracha. Asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al mitzvat, al mitzvas. Sorry. Asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al netilat yadayim, but it still says kedishanu b'mitzvotav, meaning Hashem commanded us with our mitzvahs. So therefore, we are already referring to a mitzvah. But when we wash our hands in the morning, we make the bracha after the mitzvah. Why? Why don't we make the bracha before? Because before we've washed our hands, they're not clean yet. So it's not appropriate to make a bracha. So this is really the first time in the day that we make a bracha in their ideal location, which is before doing the mitzvah. Please God, we'll take off from here tomorrow as far as putting on the talis. We've inspected it, and now we're ready to make a bracha. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi. Moshe.
Good. Kyle.